Welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Stephanie Domerat. New data from the CDC shows the U.S. birth rate dropped to the lowest level on record last year. The news is sparking a lot of conversation and a lot of questions. And today we're looking into answering some of those for you, including, is the decline being driven by biology, culture, or policy, and what can be done? Plus, what this complex issue means for Oregon, Washington, and beyond. Joining us to break this down is Dr. Paula Amato. Dr. Amato is a professor of OBGYN at OHSU and the division head of reproductive endocrinology and infertility at OHSU. She's also a fertility specialist at Spring Fertility in Portland. And Dr. Ethan Shurigan, the director of Portland State University's Population Research Center. Dr. Shurigan's expertise covers a wide range of topics, including demographic consequences of disasters, mortality and longevity forecasting, and evaluating the quality of census data. Paula, Ethan, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure.
Appreciate your time. I want to start with you, Ethan, really, and the data that came out in these numbers. So in 2024, the U.S. birth rate hit an all-time low, just below 1.6 births per woman. Keep in mind the replacement rate to keep the population the same would be 2.1 births. So that's kind of the number that people would generally shoot for. So why is this a historic moment? Why is this so significant? And what does this say to you about the U.S. and the direction we're looking at?
You're right, 2.1 is a really significant number. The meaning of that is that if you have on average 2.1 children per family, that you have 2 children who survive through their reproductive ages, and therefore you have a stable population. The U.S. has been below replacement for a while, but I think what the latest numbers suggest is that this is really not something where we're going to resume and return back to 2.1. This has been a continuing trend for a long time. So the reason the U.S. first went below that number was because of declines in the young age fertility rates, the teen birth rates, and even early 20s, associated with people starting greater access to college, more education. And what we're seeing now is that the birth rates are remaining low even at older ages. So what the numbers say to me is that we're actually headed from a low fertility regime to potentially lowest low, what demographers call lowest low, which is a fertility rate between 1 to 1.3, what we already see in some places in Europe and East Asia. And that represents a norm of higher numbers of women who just forego children completely.
Altogether. Yeah. So I want to ask specifically in Oregon, what is our birth rate here in Oregon, typically and now?
Well, it used to be a lot closer to the U.S. average for a long time. But in the past 15 years or so, Oregon's decline has been faster. So it's around 1.4, quite a bit below. And if you look at an urban area like Portland, it's actually below 1.0. So it's,
Wow.
Yeah, quite a bit lower.
So what does that mean for the economy? I mean, for people to kind of break down why it's important to have that 2.1 number, the replacement rate. What does that mean for Oregon's economy?
That's a really complicated question. I mean, the first things that comes to mind is that we have fewer children. That means lower school enrollments. That has fiscal implications, positive and negative for the state budget, and certainly for local school districts, presents challenges. The economic consequences, though, are a little more complicated. So, fewer children means maybe fewer parents who are taking time off to care for children. That means more labor force participation, potentially. So, demographers call this a demographic dividend that can happen when you have, extra time spent in the workforce, more savings set aside, perhaps. And in the long run, though, the question is about whether productivity gains can offset a lack of population growth.
I would also wonder, Social Security is something, right, we pay into. So if you have less people, younger people to pay for Social Security, that seems like a big alarm to me.
Yeah, we have set up our system with the assumption that population will continue growing indefinitely. And I mean, just that has been a standard assumption for a long time. If you looked until the mid-2010s at the Census Bureau's or the UN's long-range forecasts, it was always that the 2-child family norm would persist. And so, when we think about programs like Social Security, I think that's more of a question of will to reform. There are, pretty minor changes that could be done to keep the trust fund in balance for a long time, but and it wouldn't require a return to replacement fertility. So I think thinking about the kind of will to make changes like that is maybe more important than what we might be able to do to get back to 2.1.
Interesting. Okay, well, speaking of what we could do or actions that are being done in response to the drop in birth rate in the U.S., we're seeing federal efforts recently by the Trump administration to change this trend. That includes an executive order in February meant to expand access and reduce costs for IVF. Just last month, under the big bill that Congress passed, there is now a federal program giving $1,000 for each newborn. Paula, what was your take when you heard about this increased support nationwide for IVF and even these so-called baby bonuses we're seeing?
Yeah, generally very positive. I think there needs to be more support for families, more support for people in general to have the number of children that they want to have and be able to raise them the way they want to raise them. Unfortunately, even though Trump issued that executive order a few months ago, so far we haven't seen any action from the administration. And just last week or the week before, we heard that maybe they're walking that back a little bit. Of course, we think infertility is a disease, not just we who practice in this field, but WHO, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, the American Medical Association consider infertility a disease, and like any other disease, treatment should be covered by insurance. And unfortunately, that's not the case in Oregon. There's no such mandate, nor nationwide. But so I think just on principle, that should happen, but whether or not it would affect the fertility rate, it would probably affect the fertility rate a little bit, but it's probably not the main driver of decreasing fertility rates.
That was going to be my next question for you. How much does infertility really impact this birth rate decline that we're seeing? So how much does it, and what else, in your mind and from your perspective, is contributing?
Yeah, it definitely contributes. Infertility is a very prevalent problem. If your viewers don't know, it affects 1 in 6 people, so that's a lot of people. Some of the changes we've seen in fertility rates, as Ethan said, have been positive things like decrease in teen pregnancy rates and that type of thing, access to contraception, et cetera, more women participating in the workforce. But there's still many people who would like to have children who can't because of infertility. And part of the issue is access. So infertility treatment can't be expensive and it's often not covered by insurance. So if we could address that, it would probably have some effect on fertility rates, but probably not huge. It's not the major driver. You asked about other reasons. I think they're kind of social cultural reasons. Again, they're good reasons it's happening, like 100 years ago, maybe you had to have 5 children because not all of them would survive to adulthood. So that's a factor too. Family size, as my understanding, has stayed relatively stable until recently. And if you ask most women, and not just women, but couples or people in general, how many children you would like to have ideally, usually the number is around 2.
Yeah, I want to ask about that 1 in 6 number you mentioned, 1 in 6 women. Is that number increasing that we're seeing, or has that just been steady for quite some time?
There does seem to be an increase. And part of the reason is women are delaying childbearing. Of course, they're pursuing education and professional opportunities, all of which is very positive. But because of that, they are starting their families later. And as you may know, and your viewers may know, as women get older, their fertility rates, their ability to get pregnant decreases. So if you start later, you might have fewer children, even if you wanted to have a bigger family.
Your window becomes smaller.
For sure, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
What was your take when those incentives, have kind of been spoken in the last few months federally?
Yeah, so I'd separate the policies on IVF and ARTs from the tax incentives or the baby bonus that we talked about. And the baby bonus idea has been one that's been studied a lot more by demographers. We have a lot of policies around the world that have kind of varying tax incentives, varying things like universal preschool and childcare. But what we see is that programs, especially cash transfer programs, tend not to change the number of children people have. They just tend to change the timing. So people who are intending to have kids maybe in a few years decide now is the right time because of this bonus. We don't know if it's going to be around. And so they kind of maybe accelerate their childbearing, but they don't tend to have more completed children by the time they reach, age 45 or something like that.
And, interesting. So it doesn't necessarily speed up the process for them, which then could contribute to being able to have more if they start earlier?
It could,
Yeah.
right? But most of the time, I think people who reach age 44 with fewer children, then it's hard to know whether that's an intention or an infertility issue there. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your other take, I guess, when you heard about the policy for IVF potentially? I mean, how does that play a role when we see those types of policies?
I think that they have an enormous impact on individuals' lives. But when we're talking about the national birth rate and these really, really big picture trends, right now ARTs I think are involved in around 2% of births. So it's not a huge number in terms of kind of a national level statistic about where population trends might go. But there's a concept that Paul identified that demographers think about a lot too, which is this gap between the desired number of children and the realized number of children. So I think that's where ARTs play a really big role in helping individuals reach those goals.
Well, speaking of desire and some of the reasons that maybe people are choosing not to have kids right now, you mentioned it about some people still wanting to have kids, but surveys do show that many younger adults do want, but they just feel like they can't justify that parenthood, whether that's economic, climate, lifestyle conditions that they're facing. According to the Pew Research Center, the number of children that the average young adult wants to have did drop significantly in the past decade. So in the years before 2012, you can see here on this graph, the number was stable at 2.3 kids. That was the average number for those adults 20 to 39 when you asked, how many kids do you want? But then from 2012 to 2023, things seemed to really shift here. The desired number of children dropped from 2.3 to 1.8 on average. So that's a significant drop. Ethan, what do you think is contributing to this shift?
Well, one big important one that we talked about earlier was education. So education performs the role of delaying, instead of childbearing because you're in school. But there's also potentially a kind of treatment effect that actually changes your goals and ambitions and what you see as possible. And so I think that socially there's been a big change in what constitutes the good life, what goals people have for themselves, and where families fit in with that. I think that's the most important thing there. And secondarily, though, I think economics are an important one. So previously, that two-child norm was pretty resilient to economic swings up and down, but the number of things that happened since the Great Recession, when we've seen the current decline, is that increasing income inequality looks like declining prospects for folks entering the job market. I think recently we saw numbers that college graduates had no better employment rate than non-graduates. So things like that are really giving maybe dim prospects to young people and really, I think, affecting that number that they're citing. Another Pew number that we saw that was really telling is that 44% of people who are currently childless, adults, don't intend to have children at all.
Interesting. Paul, what was your take with those numbers and kind of the change?
Yeah, I agree with Ethan. I think one of the main factors is affordability. It's just very expensive to have children. You mentioned climate change. I think especially among young people, they think that having children will impact climate change, and climate change is something they really care a lot about. But I think another way to state what Ethan was talking about is the opportunity costs has changed, especially for women. Maybe 50 years ago, there weren't that many options of what you were going to do with your life. But now there are, not just for women, but even for men. And so I think people are just weighing, they're like, do I want to have 2 children, or do I want to have one and whatever, travel more,
yeah.
whatever it is. I think that's one of the main drivers.
I want to ask, it's been 5 years, obviously, since COVID-19, the pandemic took place kind of in that window that we saw this decline from the 2.3 to the 1.8 of desired kids. How did birth rates change around the pandemic, and is this still playing a role here? Ethan, let's start with you.
Yeah, COVID kind of had a tick-tock dynamic. So the first thing that happened was that conceptions declined during the pandemic. And then, we saw a decline in the birth rate as a result. Weddings were held off, and a lot of things impacted people's lives. There was a bit of a recovery afterwards, and the year after, I think a lot of those weddings were rescheduled. A lot of conceptions happened that were probably, put off. But then very quickly, back to trend. So the birth rate effect is pretty different from mortality rate effect, where we still see long-run consequences, but birth rates have just resumed their downward decline. And I think if COVID had any long-lasting effect, it might have been, more time spent maybe on social media, less time spent, in dating. It's really changed, markets. We know from studies of fertility that kind of social norms are transmitted through things like influencers, even as back as far as the 19th century. So the more kind of transmission of ideas and norms through social media, that might have been one long-lasting consequence of COVID.
Interesting. Paula, what did you see with your clinics and with your patients around that conversation?
Yeah, exactly the same pattern. So right in the thick of COVID, of course, we saw a decrease in number of people seeking fertility care, and then we saw a bit of a rebound in 21, 22, and then rates have pretty much stabilized. I mean, we're very busy, as I said. Infertility is a very prevalent problem, but I would say nationally, from what we know about the statistics, it's the people accessing IVF care or infertility care is pretty stabilizing, maybe plateauing a little bit. And whether that's because of affordability or some other reason, we're not sure.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and we will have more with our guests coming up right after this. Stay with us. And welcome back to Straight Talk. Thanks for joining us. We are continuing our conversation on declining birth rates here in the U.S. with our expert guests, Dr. Paula Amato and Ethan Sherigan. Thank you again for being here, both of you.
Thank you.
Let's dive right back into it. We were talking about the impacts of the pandemic going into break, but I want to ask you now, Paula, we talked a little bit about it in the first half, but infertility, of course, only being a small piece of the puzzle here when we're talking about declining birth rates. But it does seem like awareness is growing around this conversation. So do you see more women who are kind of surprised that this is an issue as they've delayed, maybe their childbearing or their family planning goals, and then they seem surprised now in their later fertility years at the reality of the biological clock?
Yeah, unfortunately, I see that all the time. Women are generally taking better care of themselves and living longer and living well longer, but they don't realize that there's this disconnect around general health and their fertility, that even if you're otherwise physically healthy, age is just one of those things that's associated with decreased fertility. I think there's more awareness now than there used to be, and I think it falls on us partly as doctors, but also in the education system to educate women, again, not just women, but men as well, about the decline of fertility with age, because now there are things that you potentially could do to mitigate that. I mean, I certainly agree that we should develop policies that would allow people to have their children in their peak reproductive years, which is 20s and 30s. But for many reasons, people are delaying, as we already talked about. So for those women, I think things like egg freezing should be accessible, certainly not a guarantee. And, I'm not necessarily advocating for people to have children in their 50s, because there's certainly complications associated with pregnancies at later ages, but perhaps shifting that fertility window a little bit if people were aware. And even if they didn't choose to freeze their eggs, at least if they knew that, they made a conscious choice to freeze their eggs or not freeze their eggs or delay childbearing with that knowledge that fertility is decreasing. I think there's some psychological benefit to that.
And what would that be that you think people really should be more aware of, though? Like, what is the timeline or the age, or like what is the details around people really needing to understand when making choices about their future?
Yeah, I mean, men continue to make sperm until they die, so that we don't see the same decline in fertility rates, but women unfortunately are born, I don't know if it's unfortunate, but we are born with a finite number of eggs, and then eventually you run out and you can't make any more. So peak fertility is really in the 20s and then starts to decline, but more precipitously in the late 30s. So ideally, you'd be having your children in your 20s and 30s if you want to take advantage of peak fertility. Now, having said that, lots of people have children late 30s, early 40s. So we're talking about population means and that type of thing. And the infertility population, remember, is a select group. There's lots of people out there that are able to get pregnant. But people should just at least be aware of that biologic phenomenon so they can make informed choices about when to have their families, whether to have a family, whether to freeze eggs, all these sort of choices and decisions around family building.
We've seen changes recently with abortion access to reproductive care nationwide when it comes to policies and new laws and legislation. So I wonder, is that having an impact on fertility decisions or any of the conversations around getting pregnant for people that you see?
I hear about it a little bit. In Oregon, we're lucky. We have very good protections, reproductive rights, but across the country, from some of my colleagues, I do hear that it is impacting fertility decisions. We've seen national data that people are accessing long-term or permanent contraception, for example, increasing rates because perhaps they're worried about getting unintentionally or accidentally pregnant in a state with restricted abortion access. So I do think it does impact people's decisions. And the data, all the data around abortion restriction shows that number of abortions don't really decrease when you do that. Just the number of safe abortions decreases, which is not necessarily a good thing. And I don't think it's a great idea that people are having more unplanned pregnancies either. I don't think as a society that's necessarily what we want. So I think whether you're talking about fertility or contraception, it's important that we, prioritize reproductive autonomy.
Ethan, what do you think? How does policy kind of play out in the population standpoint?
I think Paul and I are on the same page on this one, that people's desires are really important. They figure out a way to realize them even when policies change. So we can look back to 1973 when the laws changed around abortion, and in fact, we saw a decline in births in young women, but they were made up later in their lives. And restrictive policies, sometimes have a short-term immediate impact, but almost always there's mitigation. So people are able to find a way around those restrictive policies.
Let's talk about policies in Oregon. As you mentioned, things, of course, different here. But Oregon did roll out the paid leave program in late 2023. A lot of people were very excited about that program. Helps with parental leave, funded by wage contributions. How is that playing out with patients that you see, Paula?
I think it's helpful. I think a lot of countries have paid leave, and the U.S. is kind of behind in that department, and I'm glad Oregon instituted I think it's a 12-week paid leave policy. Unfortunately, with respect to fertility rates, even those countries that have those very generous, paid leave policies, we still see those decreasing fertility rates. So again, in isolation is probably not enough, but it needs to be combined with other policies.
What would you say about the impacts to population trends and with these kind of policies to support maybe paid leave or preschool for all that we see in Multnomah County?
Yeah, those programs are great because they help people often attain the desired number of children. So programs like that can help maybe soften the decline, soften the landing. If we look at the most generous programs maybe that exist in Scandinavia, those countries maybe around 1.7 to 1.9, they haven't gotten back to replacement, but they're not as low as they might be. So some of the innovators and pioneers in the space actually, these programs have always been tied to concerns about population growth rate and birth rates. Think about a country like France, which was the first to experience significant fertility declines, and among the first to roll out universal preschool very much in a desire to help. And so France has maintained a slightly higher fertility rate than other places in Europe, but it's still not really at replacement. So what it's done there is just help make it possible for people who do want to have children but face economic hardship, help them actually realize their intentions, but it doesn't change intentions.
We only have about a minute, so I want to ask you as we end this episode, what is the big picture kind of long-term impact when we see declining birth rates? Like, is this something that should be alarming, or is this something that maybe we should think differently about going forward?
I think it's a wake-up call that we should revisit programs that we have that are predicated on the assumption of population growth forever. That's no longer a good assumption. It hasn't been for a while. And I think that it's more realistic that we can get the social will to work on those programs than that we're going to be successful in pushing national fertility rates back up to replacement level. It's not necessarily a negative thing, though. Aging is a consequence, but so your readers or viewers may have heard of the concept of the dependency ratio, which is the number of working age adults to children or elderly. And that, a lot of times when you hear concern about the declining population growth rate, it's framed in terms of an increasing dependency ratio, more aged population per worker. But that's kind of itself an outdated concept, that folks are remaining active into their lives, even remaining working longer, they're retaining some attachment to labor force longer. So things like that can really offset the effects of lower population growth.
I appreciate your time. We're out of time. Ethan, Paula, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week on Straight Talk.